First, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Sure.
All right, let's jump into this. So it's been a few days. We know that Attorney General Jeff Landry is now the governor-elect of Louisiana. What were the numbers, and were they what you were expecting?
I and probably nearly everybody else in Louisiana was surprised that he was able to win without a runoff. And his getting 52% of the vote compared to Sean Wilson's 26%, that to me is an unambiguous margin. And I certainly wasn't expecting anything that large.
Well, when you were looking at early voting results, were they kind of skewed in this direction?
So when I started off with early voting, I was mentally expecting something like 45 to 31, which is the percentage of the vote Jeff would have gotten versus the percentage of the vote Sean Wilson would have gotten. As the night was going on, however, I was noticing, particularly in the rural parishes, Jeff was nearly, without exception, overperforming expectations, and so that 45% became 47%, while as Sean, almost without exception, underperformed my expectations, and he was getting 29%. Then when you combine that with the election day vote, which was even more favorable for Jeff, Jefferson Parish was a perfect example where a Jeff lead of +4 went to +14 with the election day vote. That all that combined enabled Jeff to win without a runoff, and so it was kind of a case of his vote share just kept going up and up and up throughout the night.
And normally, I mean, it usually does go to a runoff, especially whenever you have only one Democratic candidate versus a bunch of other Republican candidates, which was the case this time.
Correct. And so the thing that was interesting to me was the fact that Sean was staying below 30, and that given the abysmally low turnout in Orleans Parish, there were not enough Democratic votes to rescue him. And the reason, of course, I'm bringing up Orleans Parish is traditionally they report later in the evening, but that vote is so monolithically Democratic. If you see a percentage change where, say, a Republican drops several percentage points in a flash, that typically means some portion of the Orleans Parish vote has reported.
So let's talk about voter turnout statewide, about how many people actually did show up and go to the polls.
So it was 36%, which was pretty low for a statewide election. However, it's not the lowest we've ever seen. One similar turnout I recall from going all the way back to 2007. In the 2011 primary, when Bobby Jindal was reelected with basically nominal opposition, that was a 37% turnout compared to the 36% that we saw Saturday night.
Is there a parish or an area that had, the lowest turnout of the entire state?
From what I remember, Orleans Parish turnout was abysmally low. More specifically, it was in the 20s.
Wow.
And that's just, especially when you had several interesting state representative and other races in the parish, for the turnout to be that low was indicative of just people were not into this election.
So let's talk about the other candidates. I mean, we know about Sean Wilson and, of course, Jeff Landry, but there were several other Republican candidates. How did they fare?
So what happened was you basically had two other Republican and an independent candidate, all of whom were spending heavily and were on TV. John Schroeder, the state treasurer, Stephen Wagaspak, the head of or former head, I should say, of the state's biggest business lobby, and attorney Hunter Lundy, who was running as an independent. All three of them finished with about 5%, which, considering the fact that they spent heavily and were on TV a lot, they did not get an appropriate return for their investment when you looked at their final showings on election night.
Wow, so hardly any of the vote was spread out between any of these candidates.
It was not statistically significant, no, because when you combine the 52 that Jeff got with the 26 that Sean got, so that's 78%, throw in the 5, 5, and 6 that the other three got, now you're talking about a percentage in the 90s. So, like I said, the vote pretty much coalesced behind Jeff and Sean, and nobody else had a chance to break through.
So there were other things that were on the ballot. So people were voting for Secretary of State and also the Attorney General. What happened with those races?
So in that race, she actually had technically two races that ended up without going to runoff. The governor's race, as we just mentioned, and Lieutenant Governor Billy Younggesser was overwhelmingly reelected with 66%. Secretary of State and Attorney General's races and Treasurer, they're all going to the November runoff. Secretary of State, you have Gwen Collins Greenup, who was run before. She'll be the Democratic quote-unquote nominee. She'll face Nancy Landry, who's a Republican and second in charge in the Secretary of State's office. The Attorney General's office, what will happen is Liz Murrell, who was Jeff Landry's right-hand person at the Attorney General's office, she's running for his old job. She finished with a very strong 46% of the vote. She'll be facing Democratic Attorney Lindsey Cheek from New Orleans. The Treasurer's race, what will happen is former Congressman John Fleming, and he's also a medical doctor and Navy veteran. John Fleming received 44% of the vote. He ran first. He'll be facing a Democrat named Dustin Granger from Lake Charles.
All right. So there's definitely some stuff that is still going to be decided. It's yet to
Yes.
come. But thank you so much for joining us. I believe we are out of time.
My pleasure.